Thanks very much, everybody, for joining today. So thanks very much, everyone. I think a few more people coming in, but it's a great privilege to welcome not just one, but I think it's 7. I haven't completely checked my counting on that, but 7 editors from JAMA and JAMA Network, and it's a great opportunity to learn about the other side of publishing medical articles. We send them in, they look at them and tell us yes or no, and I think it's a real opportunity to find out how we can increase our probability of the yes rather than no. And also, certainly in my personal experience, the ways in which working with editors of journals improve what you've written enormously. And I mean, certainly with JAMA, but also with many other journals, that's been my experience, that looking at what they've said to you, carefully thinking about what they've said to you, and then trying to incorporate it into the revised paper. So we're going to start with a talk by Kirsten Domingo about trust and trends in medical publishing. She's the 17th editor of JAMA, editor-in-chief of JAMA, and the JAMA Network. She's the Lee Goldman Endowed Professor of Medicine, Professor of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at University of California, San Francisco, general internist, cardiovascular disease epidemiologist. So I can see a number of your colleagues in the audience here, cardiovascular disease epidemiologist and a national leader in prevention and interventions to address health disparities. And the whole team have been recently at the European Society of Cardiology that has just completed yesterday, that was at the Excel Centre in London. She's then going to have a kind of a pause and then give another talk focusing on publishing in the JAMA Network. She'll lead the questions, but she has all her colleagues here. So I just wanted to mention them. Robert Bauner, editor-in-chief of JAMA Cardiology. Greg Kerfman, executive editor of JAMA. Philip Greenland, senior editor for JAMA. Sadia Khan, associate editor of JAMA Cardiology. Rohan Kira, associate editor for artificial intelligence and digital health, and Greg Marcus, associate editor, and someone I've worked with in the past. So there's plenty of time for discussion. There are some nice binders here and pens should you want to take away a physical memory of the meeting. I did want to mention a couple of further talks that will occur today. So after lunch, Greg Marcus is going to give a talk here on his adventures in digital health research, alcohol, coffee, and arrhythmias, which will be our first Richard Doll seminar of the season. And then the regular seminars will start again in October. And then late this afternoon, we will be celebrating Will Harrington's appointment as professor. And again, you're very welcome to come to that, and there will be a reception afterwards, so I hope you will be able to join us. But I'll now stop and hand over to Kirsten to talk about how do we get our papers into their journal. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the very kind introduction. And it's wonderful to be here with all of our editors. So, as was stated, I'm going to divide this into 2 talks, and what I really hope that you'll Some will be thought-provoking. We hope to get some great questions from the audience. I invite my editors to join me in helping to answer some of these questions, and I'd invite you to spend some time meeting our editors at over lunch. I think it's one of the things that I think really distinguishes our journals is the strong academic presence that we have on our editorial team. So our editors really are, they're faculty members at the university university. They are authors themselves. They think a lot about the experience of authors. And one of the things that we have spent a lot of time doing is trying to think about how we can make the experience of submitting to journals, to getting your papers published, to making papers accessible to readers, be that experience that we have as authors and readers ourselves. So what I'm going to start to talk about, though, is a little bit apart from just selling JAMA and the JAMA network to you, but talk a little bit about these larger trends that are going on in publication, and to think collectively with you, because we are all part of a big biomedical enterprise. No matter where we work in that big biomedical enterprise, we have as a goal improving health for our patients, for populations, and whether we're engaged in conducting trials or doing surveillance or publishing these results, we all have to think about how what we are doing is actually perceived by those that we hope to influence with this work. So I'm, as was said before, I'm the editor-in-chief, the 17th editor-in-chief of JAMA and the JAMA Network. I've been in this position for 2 years. And prior to this, I had spent all of my time at UCSF as a professor. I chaired the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics. I was a vice dean there, very involved in both my own academic work, which is in hypertension, in national leadership on guidelines, and then decided to make this shift, having never done any editorial work before. And part of this was that during the pandemic, as the pandemic influenced, I'm sure, many of us, the pandemic made clear to me that how remarkable science is for really taking something new and then figuring out very quickly how we can approach our collective response to making sure that this global pandemic wasn't as deadly as it could have been, but also thinking through many of the pitfalls and many of the ways in which either in science or medicine or in sort of the larger social context in which science and medicine play out, things didn't work quite as we all expected. And journals play a big role in the center of that, because journals publish, they help determine what is science we can trust. They are important for setting the context around our scientific discourse and our medical discourse and the regulatory discourse. And so when we think about what went wonderfully well during the pandemic and what we could do better, journals have a big role to play. So when the opportunity came up to lead this set of journals, I thought this would be a really interesting way to think about the work that we all do, as was just stated, from the other side, and think about how we might do that better. At the center of all this is, of course, trust. Do we trust what we read on the pages when a journal publishes it? Do we trust what an author has sent in to us? Does somebody who sits outside of the biomedical enterprise trust what they read and what we say really is the standard now based on a scientific study? And what I want to talk about is 3 trends that I think really shape and come together in good and sometimes not so good ways right now that influence trust. The first looks at headlines like this: a flood of fake science forces multiple journal closures, right? So this is from the Wall Street Journal, published earlier this year. This is, of course, not JAMA Network. It's not any of our peer journals. But these types of headlines in the major popular press does influence how people perceive what's happening in scientific publications. And we can say this is not work here at this institution. It's not our journals. But we also know that these headlines have extended to other major institutions. And there's now quite an industry looking at are those figures exactly what they claim to be? Are the citations exactly what they claim to be? And we see these headlines more and more. Troubles arise amid pressures to publish, too many journals and too few reviewers. So not only questioning a particular author, but also the entire enterprise, and whether this is a problem of peer review, a problem of journals, a problem of academic institutions. What's the problem here, right? So the first thing that I would raise in terms of trends is the issue of trust. And I would say, and I'm speaking here mostly because I see this in our local context. I don't want to claim that this is the same in the UK, but certainly there is a rise of mistrust of the experts, right? And so that some of what drives many of these headlines is the idea that, well, the experts say this, but you really can't trust them because can't you see all those journals had to close? There were these professors at these big institutions. And again, we can say this is not work that we're engaged in. It doesn't affect us, but indirectly it does affect us because what is painted with the same brush is all of the peer review literature, all of the scientific literature, and can we trust this? And does it matter? To some extent, it matters, to the extent that we are all publicly funded, to some extent, to the extent that that certainly our regulatory bodies are all part of the larger societal context. The issues of mistrust that have layered over science, I think, is something that all of us have to pay attention to and think about what it means for our enterprise. The second trend that I want to talk about, and I want to talk about these next two trends as forces that can help facilitate trust. That's how we think about them, but also can, when run amok, sort of continue to fuel the types of mistrust that's out there. The second I would talk about is what I'm going to call accessible science. I'm not going to use the term here open access, which is a term that is very important. And I'm going to use this term accessible science because at the root of all that we do is that science is better when there is transparency in it, when we can see what the results of an experiment are, how that experiment was conducted so that I can conduct a follow-up experiment, that if I'm the person who wants to translate a scientific finding into health, that I have access and can read what that finding is. It is the spirit and principle behind open science and open access is that we really have to make the work that we do available to those who, whether a part of an academic community, a medical community, the larger society, really should have access to that science. Now, early on in my tenure, we made the decision to make all of the scientific articles across the JAMA network publicly available, public access. We do have 2 open access journals, so we're a big fan of open access, and where one pays a fee to the publisher in order to have that article published. This is a broader policy that applies to all of our journals that says an author can deposit a manuscript in a public repository on the day it's published in JAMA or any JAMA network journal without charge. And so that might be one of the large public repositories or an institutional repository. In the US, this is a version of this policy was announced at the NIH that would apply to all NIH-funded research, and many funders are obviously interested in this idea of access, and this is often called green open access because there's no money that changes hands here, and it really sits apart from the publishing models. In this editorial, we noted a few things that are sort of challenging in the open access discussions right now. One is that while open access has really put an emphasis on accessibility to the reader, it has placed really the burden on the scientist and actually, to some extent, placed publishing out of the reach for many authors. These might be authors who are early career authors or those in less well-funded disciplines or in less well-resourced settings. The types of fees that oftentimes come along with open access really do raise the question about equity in access to publishing. And that is something that I think we all have to pay attention to. Similarly, we all have to pay attention to the fact that we need to pay for the things that we value, because at its heart here in publishing are that if we value peer review and the editorial process and the publication process, then those things, we have to figure out a funding model for them that isn't against our goals of equity, but also is in keeping with our goals of accessibility. And that is part of the larger conversation that I think funders, academic institutions, journals all have to be part of. It is worth noting that coincident with the rise of open access as a way to think about publishing scientific articles, there have also been the rise of these megajournals. Now, megajournals here, Dr. Ioannidis from Stanford describes as those journals who publish more than 3,000 articles in a given year. Just for scale, JAMA publishes 200, the Lancet publishes about 200, and JAMA Network our open access journal publishes about 2,000. These are journals that at the very top publish 20,000, and you can see down to 3,000. Now, I will say here that I have published in many of these journals. Many of these journals are outstanding journals. So this is not to cast aspersion on these journals. But I will also note that on this list are many journals that have been delisted for predatory practices. And I think the issue is when you are paid, when you make your money per article published, you have to set a standard for how to make sure that you're also keeping the high standards we have for rigor in scientific publishing, for making sure that that these practices are not predatory to authors or to readers. And it's pretty clear that many of the journals on this list have clearly, by the standard set, violated those, and that this is on the rise. So the number of articles published every year is on the rise. The number of journals like this, as many as get delisted, these journals prop up all the time. And the important thing here is that these are peer-reviewed journals. So when people say, oh, we don't like the peer-reviewed literature, they're talking about this literature as well as all the other literature that we're talking about of journals that you usually think of and are reading. And my colleague, who is the editor of one of the preprint servers, reminds me that the studies that show that, COVID started from volcanoes or snakes all came from peer-reviewed literature, right? And so this is something that, as people talk about the problems with peer-review literature, this is something that sits in the backdrop. It also sits in the backdrop of the burden on peer reviewers. And I'm sure all of you get questions and invitations to peer review. And the rise of these types of publications, the rise of publications in general, is actually another burden on the limited pool of people who review peer review papers as well. So the former editor from the British Medical Journal basically described this in a blog post earlier this year, noting that the insatiable pursuit of publications and academic institutions wanting more publications with the pursuit of money, publishers getting paid per article published, has created a force that probably doesn't work well all the time. And in this blog post, he basically says that, in English and in Latin, the misconduct is the result of either money or sex, but in science publishing, it's money or publications. And I think many editors who are thinking about this, even when we understand the importance of open access and accessible science, will say that there are elements of this particular model that are probably not moving in the right direction. The last thing that I would notice is artificial intelligence, and just reflect on this for a second. So AI is clearly a technology that is going to help us in many things that are important about accessibility in science. It will help us in writing manuscripts, particularly for those who are early to manuscript writing or for whom writing in English is not their native language. It will help us to make content more accessible as we adapt to other languages and to non-technical audiences, which is really critical for the work that we all do. And it will be helpful, although I think how it will be helpful for finding content, I think is also something that will improve over time, although you can tell me whether you like your Google search results right now. I think these are the forces that in publishing are going to be good for publishing and for those who are readers of the scholarly literature. The AI has created its own challenge, of course, and JAMA has been at the forefront of trying to help guide authors about how to think about incorporating use of large language models in their publication process. This ChatGPT was introduced November 2022. We published this in January, the end of January of 2023. When we published this, ChatGPT had already been indexed in PubMed several times as an author. And so this was a reminder that no, a chatbot cannot be an author, cannot actually testify to the legitimacy and integrity of the scholarly process. And we've continued to publish these over time to help guide authors, not to say you cannot use these tools. These are very helpful tools, but to give guidance on how to use them appropriately and how to tell editors how you're using them. It is clear that people are using them, and so this is obviously not from the medical literature, but this is the introduction to this piece. Certainly, here is a possible introduction to your topic, right? And so these are obviously a failure of the editorial process and a failure of authorship, right? So so this is clear, and hopefully you're at least figuring out how to take those little prompts out of your scholarly writing, and hopefully you're telling us as editors when you're using these large language models in your writing. There have been attempts to classify how much help authors are using these chatbots for. I think my colleagues who actually are skilled in understanding, these types of investigations say that these are clearly underestimates, and so you shouldn't trust them. But they do suggest that people are using these types of technologies in their writing. The things we're, of course, concerned about, and those of you who think about or use these chatbots or any large language models, you know that they're good at some things and not that good at other things. They're not really search engines for the scholarly literature. They're prone to hallucinations. This is an article published in JAMA Ophthalmology showing between ChatGPT 3.5 and ChatGPT 4, some things had improved, but clearly the hallucinated citations, which are in red, clearly got worse over time in terms of just the number of citations that are just made up. So this is important to think about. How much is ChatGPT used in peer review? What I worry about is the volume of peer review that people are asked to do means people will take shortcuts to do them, and ChatGPT is one of those types of shortcuts. And this was a piece that was published in Nature that showed at this meeting, they suggested about almost 17% of the peer review reports were actually generated by chatbots. So what do we worry about in publishing when it comes to AI? We worry about the improper use of large language models, like with the hallucinated citations and things like that. There is going to be issues of evolving verification and attribution of derivative content as more and more summaries of content are out there and available in the literature. Obviously, fraud happens without AI, so I don't think AI means fraud, but it will certainly be easier to do many types of activities that are not in line with the integrity of scientific process. And I worry a lot here about just the creation of data sets that are not actually correctly collected data, because I think those will be the ones that are being most challenging to figure out. And then we worry about fraud at scale, because that's the thing that these types of technologies are very good at. So 3 trends, perhaps a rising mistrust in those experts, our goal of making science accessible, but then having this unintended or maybe intended consequence of having more and more publications, not all of which really then withstand scrutiny. And then this wonderful technology that is going to help us, but also I think threatens to perhaps lead us to question maybe what we will read. And so I don't bring these up to offer the solutions. I do bring these up to to say that these are, to me, parts of the issues that we as a larger scientific biomedical community will have to think about. These are not solutions that will come solely from journals or solely from academic institutions, but these are some things that I thought much less about before I became an editor, and I think much more about, and I think really need more discussions across our academic communities. So I'm going to take a brief pause here to see if this prompted any questions or ideas from all of you.
Fantastic, fascinating talk. People online, if you want to put any questions in the chat, please do. Pardon?
You all can ask a question.
And if there are questions in the back, how do I get the speakers on? It's here. That's great. Yeah, Kirsty at the back.
Thank you for a lovely, wonderful talk. I was wondering what you were thinking about medical students and the pressure to publish. I supervised quite a few of those, and since my day, which was some time ago, they all seem to be under immense pressure, even as medical students, to publish an article. And I kind of think that perpetuates this idea of publishing in very small things, the serum marmalade, whatever they can get their hands on. And it sort of builds momentum to this culture of publishing articles that may not be particularly helpful, but also I think it breeds in them an idea that just publishing anything is the goal, rather than answering an important question and answering it reliably. I wonder what your thoughts are, particularly having been about.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I do think, and I don't like, to the extent that academic institutions in applications to residency or fellowship are looking at the depth of a publication list for somebody who really is probably not that much involved in all of these publications. I just don't think, I think it creates those incentives and it reinforces those for medical students. I do think research experiences for medical students are terrific. And usually my advice to medical students is to become part of a great team and learn how a team asks and answers questions, to be part of that. If you can continue to be part of that process and somehow have contributed enough to make your name on something else within that group, I think that's great. It's wonderful to learn about the scientific process, even if you're not going to be involved in leading that into the future. But I agree with you that the pressure. And so when medical students come to me and say, well, that they are expecting a publication, they're expecting to be a first author on, I'm like, well, that's not going to happen, right? But I also advise people, there are things that you might like as a medical student, but your goal is to be part of a good research group, more than that you want to save the world with that publication. Like that, because that's where you're going to learn so much more. I mean, that's how we all learned. I
think it's similar for doing a higher degree or PhD or whatever. Often people are told they must have an idea of their own, do everything on it, whereas actually some of the best projects are really big collaborative ones.
Absolutely.
And I think that's also feed. Sorry, one follow-up question. With peer review, I mean, it takes time, and it was interesting what you were saying there. Do you think there's a better way to sort of acknowledge people who do take the time to peer review, that they can, I know sometimes journals publish a list of top reviewers and things like that. I just wondered if you wanted to comment on that, because it's often almost seen as a bit of altruistic, trying to do something else.
Yes. So let's acknowledge we're built on this system of, our collective responsibility to provide input, right? Many people will talk about, well, journals don't value peer reviewers, and think about, should we pay them? And my personal view on that is, I can't possibly pay you enough to actually value your contribution, your expertise, and your contribution to the paper. But we do have to value peer reviewers and the peer review process. So we have, in addition to the publishing the top, we've been doing much more to write letters for your promotions committee to say that you're one of our top reviewers, and that you do a lot of reviews, and that you do expert reviews. I'd like to figure out other ways that we can value and show that value to other things that might be important to you, like academic promotions. I also worry a lot about those who are early on in their careers, because the invitations that you all get, I get to peer review, they get people who are earlier in their careers and who know less about what to say yes to, what to say no to, how to write a good peer review, that I don't necessarily want 2 pages of like well-formulated prose, that if you're the expert and give me the 3 things that are really the keys about why this is really important or really terrible, that's going to be more valuable to me. And so I've talked a lot at other institutions about how we help those earlier in their careers to learn how to do peer review well and learn how to make decisions about what to do.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts on AI, specifically chatbots, the writing papers. I was just a little curious to hear your kind of either use or opinions on actually the use of these tools from the editorial side.
Yeah, so we, part of editorial work is playing defense, right? So you're going to do something bad, and we're going to catch you, right? So we use those tools a lot, right? We use those tools to make sure that there's no plagiarism, to make sure that we're actually searching all the citations and things like that. So those tools have been around for a long time. We've kept pace with those, and we're going to keep pace. We're a set of journals that have an infrastructure that's been around for a while, so these tools are great. I think what's intriguing to me is thinking less about defense and more about how do we make the peer review process even better, right? How do we abstract out things in an article that I might send you something for peer review, but I might be able to have a tool abstract out the things that are really relevant in the methods, right? That it has this amount of missing data, that these are the techniques that were used and things like that, that might be helpful actually in doing something. So I think it's an evolving landscape. And I think the idea that we start out by saying, well, we're going to use all the tools so we can catch all the other bad stuff that's going to come, that is what we have to do. It's part of our responsibility to ensure the integrity of the work. But what I'm intrigued about also is the idea that one might use these tools to help facilitate better reviews so that you're focused on the things that you can uniquely tell me about a paper, which would be important. And then I think the areas of with generative AI to like create language summaries, things like that, I think that's where you're going to see a lot more in publishing, which will be a good thing.
Could I come back to your first point about trust and how journals and indeed others might deal with deliberate misinformation, disinformation?
Yeah.
I mean, we saw it during the pandemic with vaccination, but of course, perhaps one of the more famous examples is the publication in the Lancet about the MMR vaccine and how it took some 12 years before the journal retracted it. The General Medical Council here took Wakefield off the medical register, not for misinformation, but for not actually declaring his financial interests.
I see.
Because they didn't think they could get him for misinformation. And I mean, I found myself in the middle of this around kind of statins and disinformation of statins. And what do you think that journals and others could do to deal more robustly, more rapidly, more compellingly with disinformation? Yeah.
So this is an area that I'm really interested in and was interested in before I started at journals. And when I started, several of the large accrediting bodies basically came to me and said, what journals should do is basically set the standard that if you said this, then we should be able to take away your license, right? We should be able to do that. And I understand that's their job. It's a very tricky position for journals to be in, right? Because journals have to be in that space for evolving science, and we have to be in a space when the science is pretty settled to say the science is pretty settled. But we also have to be in a position to publish sort of the larger discourse, right? And so I have evolved in 2 ways that I'm sure we have to act, and what we focused on, and the third that I'm more uncomfortable with. The first is that people generally trust their physicians. They trust the people locally, and so we as a journal have to be really good at making sure we can communicate scientific findings. And we've actually launched a new series in our journal on communicating medicine, which is for clinicians on how do you communicate about a scientific finding. Because that is clearly in our lane, and that hopefully it is helpful. I think about this large middle that of people in society who just have poor quality information. They don't have high quality information. And I think we have to do more in being more compelling and getting our word out to that. Because the failure to do that is just allowing people who might have a wrong view, but also oftentimes have very strong political agendas, very strong machinery that is actually promoting that wrong view. And so we've got to be better and play that same game at putting the information we believe is scientifically valid out there as well. And then the last piece, though, is like the speaking out against the people who are active promoters. And there, I think we have to do that. And especially in that case where there is a publication that is at the basis, I think journals have to do that. When it becomes part of the larger discourse, I think it's important for journals to be clear, but I don't believe they can influence it as much as.
Thanks very much. Yes, a question over there.
Hello, thank you so much for your talk. So as an early career researcher, I found it really interesting when you were talking about the kind of predatory practices of some journals compared to the kind of more credible journals. And I think one thing that I find really interesting is there's a lot of temptation as an early career researcher to go for a journal that is perhaps not as robust with their peer review process and perhaps isn't going to look into your work with as much detail and with a much broader toothed comb. And how do you think that we can encourage early career researchers to kind of maintain the integrity of their work and actually want to submit their work to journals that are going to properly peer review them?
So here's where, I would hope that you are working with a mentorship team or other more seasoned investigators who might help guide you. What I worry about is that you might say, well, JAMA's out of reach, so therefore I'm going to apply here. And you might have very good work that it might not be out of reach. And I would say, so I would say now, we have a range of journals. I would say JAMA Network Open in particular publishes a lot from folks early in their career. And they, I would venture to say, people who are early in their career learn a lot from publishing when there's a back and forth with the editor on what a paper means. And I myself had a paper early on in my career in JAMA that was rejected at JAMA. And I learned from my senior investigator how to appeal an editor's rejection. And then I learned, because the editor sat down and talked with me. And basically told me, like, this is what we look for at JAMA. This is why we can't publish this the way it is. If you do these types of things, you'll learn more. That, for me, that conversation and that experience was way more valuable, right? And that's the type of thing that is that subtle thing that gets missed if we're just trying. Now, I think science has to get out there. In fact, I published a lot on preprint servers during the pandemic. So there's a lot of ways that, the science just has to get out there. But thinking that this is just part of the process where, anything goes and it's part of the peer review process, I just don't think is just good way to learn to be a good academic.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your talk.
Yes.
And I really like your, the future trends of the publication. And what I'm interested is about this. So nowadays there rise a lot of, preprints and open access publishing and other new forms, just like video journals. Last year there's a really controversial research that is the room temperature superconductive material that's done by the Korean scientists. And so in China, there comes a trend that's many labs, as long as they got the information and they just do the experience online and to show the public how they do that and how can they achieve this. Is this material really is that room temperature superconductive material? And actually the AI also, they are getting more powerful and they make a lot of frauds in the scientific publication. Just I have seen reports from the Science or Nature. I don't really remember, but they tell that they can make fraud pictures of tissues, Western blots, and that's really is, affect the traditional publication.
Yeah.
So how do you think this, new trends of ways of publication, can affect the traditional medical publication models? And how do you think the JAMA will make the transformation, maybe to something kind of new models or something?
Well, I mean, I do think, just as I said before, like it goes to the misinformation. Like, I believe there's a whole large group in the middle that journals just have to be better at communicating science too. And that means thinking about all of the different platforms that people read and listen and I don't know, the medical students in the US, everyone's on TikTok, everyone is doing, so when I say, oh, we need to be on TikTok, it's like, no, yes, that's what you're going to see, so all of those things are going to happen. We have to both do the job that the top medical journals have always done well, which is to provide the standard for peer review, the standard for editorial review, that vetting process. We have to do better than we've ever done it before. And then we have to learn how to disseminate the way every modern communication platform disseminates, right? Because that has to be our goal, right? Is doing both. And then we have to understand and be a little bit, at least keep pace with the investigators and what they're going to do good and what they're going to do that might be a little bit more fraudulent on the other side, which is, to create images. And that's why some journals like Science took a very clear position early on with the chatbots and said, don't use them. No AI. They were very clear. And, when I talked to their editor, they're like, they've been burned on the Western blots. They've been burned on so many things that they're like, no, until I know how to evaluate this, if you've used it, and if I found out you've used it, that paper's not coming here. So we're all learning how to figure out how to take the best and make sure we avoid the worst.
We have some time for questions at the end. So I know there are a few more people with hands up, but perhaps hand over to you for your second part of your
fantastic
talk, and have some time at the end for questions.
Right. So now I get to give you my my promo JAMA Network speech, but hopefully to tell you about what we're interested in and set up to have your conversation with the editors. So just to let you know that JAMA has been around since 1883 and consistently one of the top 5 journals in science and medicine in the world. It is the most widely circulated medical journal in the world. JAMA is the flagship journal of the JAMA Network, which is a network of 13 journals. So I'm the editor-in-chief of JAMA. I'm here with Greg Kerfman, who is the executive editor of JAMA, has a long history of editorial leadership at major journals, including at the New England Journal of Medicine, and Phil Greenland, who is a professor at Northwestern and is one of our senior editors. Greg Marcus is one of our associate editors, so at UCSF, and so academics, long history, and really we've been doing this for a while. So JAMA is one of 13 journals. Most of these are subspecialty journals, so journals that specialize in a particular area. Each of these have their own editor-in-chief. That's an editor who is a professor at a university and is the editor-in-chief and forms the editorial team for that particular journal. We share the same publication platform. We share the same sets of guidelines and procedures. We have transfers to the other between journals of the JAMA network, but each of the editors editors have their own process of making the decisions for their journal. Bob Bono is here. He's the editor-in-chief of JAMA Cardiology and a professor at Northwestern, and Sadia Khan, who's a cardiologist and is an associate editor at JAMA Cardiology. And it's not just that I love cardiology. We're here because we were also at ESC. JAMA Network Open is our open access journal, and it is the top, in terms of journal impact factor, the top open access journal of its size that publishes the volume that it publishes. So it's a really terrific team there and of editors, and a terrific way in which some work that might be more preliminary for one of our other journals might be a single site, might be a finding that's important but not multi-site or particular designs, oftentimes finds homes there. And I'd encourage you to look at their website for their priorities. They have a new editor-in-chief who's an infectious disease expert, and so you'll see a lot of different things that we do together with them. The great thing that people say, my editors say, and I've heard this on other times, is that we're a nice family because we're small but not too small. And so these editors, we all know each other. We try to work together in terms of thinking about how to highlight work, and there's a lot of advantages to having a team of academic editors who are thinking about what's most important in their field and how we can highlight that across the same platform that we publish on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about JAMA, and about our research publications. So we have two big types: the original investigations, about 3,000 words, and then I like to always highlight our research letters, 600 words. These are good for a single finding type of study. Every year, one or two of our top cited articles is a research letter. So I encourage people, if you have one observation that you want to make and needs to get out there, don't try to make it into, many more observations, because sometimes that one observation should get out there. What type of science are we interested in? About half of what we publish are clinical trials, just because of the robustness of that design for the types of questions we have in clinical practice. Of course, that means about half of what we publish are observational studies. So it doesn't mean that we are only interested in clinical trials. We're balanced every year. And I think you'll find across the network, we're interested in trials, but also publish a large amount of observational studies as well. At JAMA, we will pursue early translational articles occasionally. The same is true across the network, especially if they're pointing us to a new mechanism or a new understanding in a particular field. And then because of AI and its the potential to transform much of how we practice or how we conduct science, we're interested in those robust trial evaluations of AI as well. I'll just talk a little bit more about our interest in clinical trials. Last year we started for the first time thinking about how can we convene experts to really understand themes that are emerging in a particular area. So we call these JAMA summits. We held a JAMA summit on clinical trials, really about this idea of clinical trials have evolved to become oftentimes a little bit too slow and a little bit too expensive and a little bit not quite the question that we have in clinical practice. How can we think about that in a way to become more robust in terms of addressing the questions we actually have in clinical or public health practice? So the attendees here were many, and this was not a to teach each other. This was a let's hash it out and see what themes emerge. This is Rob Califf, who's the U.S. Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, Deb Cook, who's a trialist in Canada, Derek Angus, who's a senior editor at JAMA and a faculty member at Pittsburgh, and Amy Abernethy, who was the former president of Verily. So thinking across sectors about many of these issues. As we came out of this summit, we issued a call for papers on both innovations in clinical trial design, as well as innovations in implementation of trial results for uptake in practice. And we've published now a few things from this. This is the first piece that really just highlighted the themes that came out of the JAMA Summit on the issues between clinical practice and clinical trials. We've published several more on this topic, and we still have this call out and we'll publish on a rolling theme. We're interested in original investigation, trial investigation, as well as the types of commentary on what types of innovations need to happen in the conduct of clinical trials to ensure they fulfill their mission to actually help us in clinical or public health practice to have the evidence that we need. We're also interested, of course, as I said, in observational studies, and in this past year published a few pieces to really help guide authors in how we're thinking about incorporating the latest in methodologies to observational studies. This was a piece we published on how we should think about causal inference from observational studies that I'd urge you to check out and let us know what you think. We will be following this up. We have a series of statistical methods series that is very popular. These are just short pieces, but thinking about how innovations in the methodology and observational studies can be incorporated to help us be more precise in our language when we talk about causal inference. And then we've given guidance on the issues of equity are really important for our journal, but we've also, along with other journals, thought about the guidance for use of race and ethnicity as proxies for genetic ancestry when one is looking at many types of observational designs, including in genetic studies. We have focused a lot on authors and readers, what is important for authors, having things come out faster. We're trying to be more efficient in our reviews, in our publications, in our transfers to other network journals. We've moved everything at JAMA to publish online first. And at the beginning of last year, we relaunched JAMA Express, which is a pathway for those that work that's being presented as a late breaker at a national or international meeting that is of timely or clinical public health importance can move to publication much more quickly. We think a lot about how to create the environment to have more discourse about things that might be more controversial or have many different sides to them. So, you'll see on the left, that's a publication of a phase 3 trial, but was published with 4 editorials. The editorials speaking to both the process, the underlying mechanism that will continue to lead to new lines of therapeutics for Alzheimer's disease, the issues of equity and how these trials are designed, the issues of the cost of these medications as they're introduced into clinical practice, and the issues for the geriatricians who are thinking about how do they incorporate new medications like this into everything else. We try to use our graphics teams to help us to help explain this for the broad clinical audience that we publish for, so that we can make clear new mechanisms. And we try to publish with different ways of using podcasts and videos and other types of things to help explain our work. So you can read a little bit more about the initiatives that we have in trying to be friendly to authors. Mostly what I want you to make sure that you do is spend some time with our editors and to feel free to write us so that we can answer your questions. We can help direct you to where you might want to be in the network of journals and help to demystify our process a little bit. So this is what our journal looks like. We publish not only the research, but opinions and also clinical review and education. And mostly I want you to know us and to reach out to us when you have any questions. I'll be open we have a few minutes left for questions here. And if I can help think about anything that I've said here.